I'm sitting here in my kitchen, my real kitchen, not that cramped corner downstairs, watching the morning light spill across my yellow ceramic tiles like honey. Ow. The coffee percolates in that old blue enamel pot Henry bought me for our 15th anniversary, the one with the chip on the handle that looks like a crescent moon. Outside my window, the pecan tree we planted in 1978 spreads its arms wide. Heavy with nuts, that'll drop soon enough. I can see Mrs. Rodriguez next door hanging laundry on her line. Her movements deliberate and peaceful. The way old women move when they know their place in this world, it wasn't always this way. 6 months ago, I was living in the basement of my own house, and my son Marcus didn't know I still owned it. The irony tastes bitter as burnt coffee grounds. You'd think a mother would remember signing away her home, wouldn't you? You'd think a son would remember who paid the mortgage for 37 years, who scrubbed the baseboards and painted the shutters and planted every single flower that blooms in the front yard come spring. But memory is a funny thing, it bends and shifts like heat waves rising off Texas asphalt, and sometimes people see what they want to see. Remember what they need to remember to sleep soundly at night. I remember the day Marcus and his wife Cheryl came to me with their plan. It was a Tuesday in March, and I was sitting on my front porch swing, the one Henry built with his own hands from cedar planks he'd been saving in the garage. The wood still smelled like sawdust and promise, even after all these years. I was snapping green beans from my garden, my fingers working automatically while I watched the neighborhood children walk home from school. Their backpacks bouncing like colorful beetles against their thin shoulders. "Mama," Marcus said, settling his large frame into the wicker chair beside me. He was 43 then, soft around the middle the way men get when they stop working with their hands and start pushing papers across desks. His father had been lean as a fence post until the day he died. But Marcus favored my side of the family. The Hutchinsons always ran two comfortable proportions. Cheryl stood behind him, our manicured hands resting on his shoulders like she was claiming territory. This was pretty in that polished way some women achieve through careful maintenance blonde hair that never seemed to grow or fade. Skin that stayed the same shade of peach no matter the season. She'd been his wife for 15 years, but I still felt like I was looking at a stranger wearing a familiar mask. "We've been thinking," Marcus continued, and I could hear the rehearsed quality in his voice. The way children sound when they've practiced a speech in the mirror. "About your situation here. It's a big old house, all by yourself. The yard work, the maintenance, it's too much for someone your age." I was 72 then. Not ancient, though I suppose to him I must have seemed fragile as autumn leaves. Ket, snapping beans, letting the silence stretch between us like taffy. The mockingbird in the oak tree ran through his repertoire: cardinal, blue jay, crow. Then something that sounded almost like a telephone ringing. "What we're proposing, Cheryl," said, stepping forward, her voice bright as fresh paint, "is that you come live with us. We have that finished basement with a separate entrance. You'd have your own space, your own little kitchenette, and we'd be right there if you needed anything." The bean snapped crisp between my fingers. Snap, drop, snap. Drop the rhythm. Was soothing, like rosary beads or knitting needles or the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. And this house? I asked, though I already knew the answer from the way they glanced at each other, quick as summer lightning. "Well, we'd take care of it," Marcus said. "Handle all the paperwork, the insurance, the taxes. You wouldn't have to worry about any of that anymore." They made it sound like a gift, like they were offering to carry my burdens on their young, strong shoulders. And maybe, in some part of their hearts, they believed that's what they were doing. Children see what they need to see to justify their desires, just like the rest of us. I looked at my house, really looked at it, the way you look at something you're about to lose. The white clapboard siding Henry and I had painted 3 times over the decades. The front steps where Marcus had learned to ride his bicycle, where I'd sat with him during thunderstorms when he was afraid of the noise. The rose bushes flanking. The walkway, climbing roses, I trained up wooden trellises, their blooms the color of ballet slippers. Let me think about it, I said, though I knew I'd already lost the battle. When you're 72 and your only child is telling you you're too old to manage your own life, what choice do you really have? You can fight, make a scene, drive wedges between yourself and the people who are supposed to love you. Or you can smile and nod and hope that grace will find its way into the situation somehow. 3 weeks later, they came with a truck and boxes in cheerful determination. I packed my life into cardboard containers while Cheryl walked through my rooms, making notes on a yellow legal pad about paint colors and furniture arrangements. She stood in my kitchen. It's the one where I'd made 37 years of birthday cakes and Christmas cookies and quiet weekday dinners for two, and talked about knocking out the wall to create better flow. You won't recognize the place when we're done, she said, and I believed her. The basement wasn't exactly what they'd promised. Yes, there was a separate entrance, though you had to walk around to the back of the house and down concrete steps that grew slick with moisture when it rained. The kitchenette was a generous term for the corner that held a tiny refrigerator, a 2-burner hot plate, and a sink the size of a mixing bowl. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck under the ductwork, and the single window looked out, at ground level, offering a view of everyone else's feet as they walked by. But I made it work. I arranged my furniture the best I could. My mother's rocking chair in the corner where the light was strongest, my cedar chest at the foot of the fold-out bed, my photographs lined up on the narrow shelf that ran along one wall. I hung lace curtains at the window and put a braided rug on the concrete floor, tried to make it feel like home instead of exile. At first, things weren't so bad. Cheryl would call down the stairs to invite me up for dinner, and we'd sit around the dining room table like a family. Marcus would ask about my day, though there wasn't much to report from my underground kingdom. The grandchildren, Talir, who was 12, and Sarah, who was 9, would sometimes venture downstairs to visit, though they never stayed long. The basement smelled like damp earth and heating oil, and children prefer their grandmothers to exist in kitchens that smell like vanilla and cinnamon, not in dark spaces that remind them too much of graves. Slowly, like morning fog lifting from a field, the invitations stopped coming. First, it was just Sundays. They were tired from the week, needed family time, too much trouble to set an extra place. Then it was weeknights too. Cheryl would send a plate down with Tyler, balanced on a cafeteria tray like I was a patient in some sad hospital. The meals were simple, efficient: a pork chop and green beans, a piece of chicken and rice, a bologna sandwich when they were having something too fancy for my simple tastes. I started to understand that I had become a pet, fed and housed, but not really part of the family. When they had company, they didn't mention the grandmother living beneath their feet. When the children had friends over, they were told not to bother Nana in the basement. I was becoming invisible. In my own house, a ghost haunting the foundation. The thermostat was the first real sign. It was July, and Texas in July is like living inside a slow oven. The basement stayed cooler than the rest of the house, but not by much, and the humidity down there was thick enough to swim through. I could hear the air conditioning running upstairs, cycling on and off with mechanical regularity. But the vents down where I lived barely whispered cool air. I climbed the stairs to the main floor, something I'd been doing less and less frequently. The house looked different. Now Cheryl had painted the walls in colors I didn't recognize and rearranged the furniture so it looked like a magazine spread instead of a place where people actually lived. She'd taken down my family photographs and replaced them with abstract prints that didn't mean anything to anyone. The grandfather clock that had belonged to my father was gone, replaced by a modern thing that looked like it belonged on a spaceship. I found the thermostat in the hallway. It's the same spot where it had been for 15 years. But now there was a clear plastic box locked over it, the kind they use in office buildings to keep people from adjusting the temperature. "Oh, that," Cheryl said when I asked about it. She was sitting at my kitchen table, their kitchen table now, painting. Her fingernails a shade of red that reminded me of warning signs. We had to do that. Tyler was always messing with it, and our electric bills were getting ridiculous. She didn't offer me the key. She didn't even look up from her nails while she spoke. That night, I lay in my basement bed listening to the house settle around me. Houses talk to themselves at night, creaking and sighing like elderly bones. I knew every sound this house made the way. The floorboards in the hallway moaned underfoot. The whistle the wind made through the gap in the bathroom window, the gentle thrum of the water heater cycling on. These were the sounds of home, but they were happening above my head now. Like memories I could hear but not touch. I thought about Henry, wondered what he would make of this situation. He'd been a quiet man, not given to dramatic gestures, but he had a way of setting things right without raising his voice. He would have known what to do. He always knew what to do. The worst part wasn't the heat or the cheap meals or the way the children looked through me like I was made of glass. The worst part was my birthday. August 15th, the day I turned 73 in a basement that smelled like damp cardboard and forgotten dreams. I woke that morning expecting what? A knock on my door? Maybe. Eh? A card slipped under the threshold. Something to acknowledge that I had existed for another year. That my presence in the world still mattered to someone. Nothing came. I climbed the stairs at lunchtime and found Cheryl in the kitchen on her cell phone laughing about something that sounded bright and meaningless. She covered the receiver when she saw me. "Did you need something?" she asked, and I realized she'd forgotten. They'd all forgotten. "No," I said, backing toward the stairs. "Just thought I'd stretch my legs." That evening, I heard them celebrating upstairs. Sarah had made the honor roll at school, and they were having a party, ice cream and music. And the sound of family joy filtering down through the floorboards like golden light I couldn't reach. I sat in my rocking chair and tried to remember the last time someone had sung happy birthday to me. Tried to recall what it felt like to be the center of attention. Even for the length of a song, it was after 9 o'clock when I remembered. The cedar chest. It had been my mother's, then mine, passed down like a secret through the women in my family. Henry used to tease me about it, called it my hope chest, even after we'd been married 20 years. I kept important papers in there, along with photograph albums and my grandmother's quilts and the baby clothes I'd saved from when Marcus was small. I hadn't opened it since the move. Some things are too precious to disturb when your world is shifting like sand beneath your feet. But that night, sitting in the dark with the sound of someone else's celebration echoing above my head, I needed to touch something that belonged wholly to me. The chest opened with a sigh, releasing the smell of lavender sachets and old paper and time itself. My fingers found the manila envelope buried beneath the quilts, thick with documents I'd organized and reorganized over the years but rarely needed to consult. Birth certificates, marriage license, Henry's death certificate, the paperwork. That proves a life was lived, and there, near the bottom of the stack, the house deed. I pulled it out slowly, carefully, like I was handling something that might crumble at my touch. The paper was heavy stock, cream-colored, with elaborate script that spoke of a time when documents were created with ceremony and pride. Margaret Louise Hutchinson, it read, and Henry James Hutchinson, husband and wife, as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Joint tenants with right of survivorship. That meant when Henry died, the house became mine alone. Completely, legally, indisputably mine. I read the document 3 times, my finger tracing over the words like I was reading. Braille? There had never been any transfer of ownership. I had never signed the house over to Marcus. In all the conversations about my situation and their generous offer to take care of things, the actual legal reality had never come up. They thought they owned my house, but they were wrong. I sat there in my basement chair, holding the deed in hands that had suddenly stopped shaking, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not anger. Anger is hot and destructive, and I was past the age where heat served me well. This was something cooler and more focused. This was clarity. The next morning, I walked to the public library 3 blocks away. I hadn't been there since the move. Cheryl had been driving me everywhere, claiming it wasn't safe for someone my age to walk the neighborhood streets. But I needed to use their computer. And I needed to do it without anyone looking over my shoulder. Google is a remarkable thing when you know what questions to ask. One found the county records office website and looked up my property. There it was, clear as morning light. Owner Margaret Louise Hutchinson. The tax records, the utility connections, the legal title, everything still listed me as the sole owner of 1247 Mockingbird Lane. I printed the pages, folded them carefully, and walked home. Home to my house, where I was living in the basement. Like a refugee in my own life. That afternoon, I called James Patterson, not the writer, but the lawyer who'd handled Henry's will and our few legal matters over the years. He was semi-retired now, working out of an office above the pharmacy on Main Street. But his voice was the same, warm and steady, like a favorite uncle. "Maggie," he said when I identified myself, "I was wondering when I might hear from you. How are you settling in with Marcus and Cheryl?" "That's actually what I'm calling about," I said, and told him the whole story. The basement, the locked thermostat, the forgotten birthday, and the deed I'd found in my cedar chest. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Maggie," he finally said, "are you telling me you never transferred ownership of the house?" "I never transferred anything. I don't even remember them asking me to." Another pause, longer this time. "Well," he said, and I could hear papers rustling. "That's interesting. Would you like me to look into this for you?" "I would appreciate that very much. Give me a few days. I'll call you back." I hung up the phone and sat in my rocking chair, watching dust motes dance in the thin stream of light from my tiny window. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not a burden or a problem to be managed, but Margaret Louise Hutchinson. Widow, mother, homeowner, citizen of the world. James called me back on Thursday. "Maggie, I've reviewed everything. Property records, the tax filings, even checked for any documents that might have been filed and forgotten. There's no question about it. You are the sole legal owner of that house. Your son and daughter-in-law are, technically speaking, your tenants. And you're a tenant in your own basement." "What does that mean, exactly?" "Means you have all the rights of property ownership. You can make decisions about the house, about who lives there, about renovations or sales. It also means that if you want to make changes to the living arrangement, you have the legal right to do so." "What kind of changes?" "Any kind you want, Maggie. It's your house." That weekend, I heard Cheryl on the phone with someone, her voice carrying down through the heating vents like smoke. She was talking about contractors, about opening up the kitchen, about putting the house on the market once they'd fixed it up properly. "The old lady won't be a problem," she said, and I knew she was talking about me. "She's not really involved in decision-making anymore." I climbed the stairs and found her in my living room, their living room surrounded by paint, samples and fabric swatches, talking to a woman with a clipboard and measuring tape. "This is the realtor," Cheryl explained, not bothering to introduce me by name. "We're just getting a preliminary assessment, seeing what improvements would add the most value." The realtor looked around with professional eyes, making notes. "Beautiful. Bones," she said. "With the right updates, this could easily go for 40% above current market value." They were planning to sell my house without asking me. They were going to profit from the home Henry and I had built together, the place where I'd raised my child and buried my husband and planned to spend whatever years I had left. That night, I called James Patterson. "I want them out," I said. "I want my house back." "Are you sure, Maggie? This is a big step. It's going to cause some family difficulties." "James, I've been living in my own basement for 6 months while my son and his wife plan to sell my house. And put me, ... Where, exactly? Some kind of facility. I think the family difficulties have already started. All right then, let's do this properly." The eviction notice was delivered on a Monday morning by a sheriff's deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I watched from my basement window as his boots approached the front door. Listened to the sound of official business being conducted in the world above my head. Marcus came downstairs an hour later. Papers in his hand, his face the color of old. "Concrete, Mama," he said. "What is this?" I was sitting in my rocking chair, knitting a scarf I'd started but never finished. The yarn was soft blue wool, the color of winter sky. "What does it look like?" I asked, not looking up from my needles. "It looks like you're trying to evict us from our own house. Your house." I set down my knitting and looked at him. This man who used to be my little boy. "When did it become your house, Marcus?" "When we took you in. When we started taking care of everything. When you got too old to manage on your own. But you never asked me to sign anything, did you? You never actually took ownership? You just assumed." He sat down heavily on my fold-out bed, the papers crumpling in his hands. "Mama, you can't be serious about this. Where are we supposed to go? The kids are in school here. Cheryl's got her book club. I've got my job." "I suppose you'll figure it out," I said, picking up my knitting again. "It's the same way I figured out how to live in my own basement. That's different. You're old. You needed help. I needed help, not erasure." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but they were true. I needed family, not exile. He was quiet for a long time, watching me knit. Finally, he said, "What do you want, Mama?" "I want my house back. I want to live upstairs, in the bedroom I shared with your father for 25 years. I want to cook in my own kitchen and sit on my own front porch and die in my own bed when the time comes. And us." I looked at him, this middle-aged man, who still somehow expected his mother to solve his problems for him. "That's up to you, son. You can find somewhere else to live, or we can work out new arrangements. But either way, things are going to change." The legal process took 2 weeks. James Patterson handled everything with the careful efficiency of a man who'd been practicing law for 40 years. The eviction was legal and ironclad. They had 30 days to vacate the premises. During those 30 days, the house felt like a war zone. Cheryl stomped around upstairs, slamming cabinet doors and talking loudly on the phone about ungrateful old women and family loyalty. Marcus tried to negotiate, offering to pay rent, suggesting we divide the house into separate living spaces. But it was too late for half measures. The children were confused and angry. Tyler, the 12-year-old, came downstairs one evening and stood in my doorway like he was visiting a dangerous animal at the zoo. "Why are you making us leave?" he asked. "I'm not making you leave," I told him. "I'm taking back my house. But it's our house too." "No, sweetheart, it never was." I tried to explain it in terms he might understand, about ownership and assumptions, and the way people sometimes take things that don't belong to them. But how do you explain to a child that adults can live their whole lives without understanding the difference between taking care of something and owning it? On the day they moved out, I hired my own crew, while Marcus and Cheryl loaded boxes into a moving truck. 3 men I'd found through the church directory carried my belongings upstairs. My rocking chair went by the window in the master bedroom, where it caught the morning light. My photographs went back on the mantelpiece and the hallway walls. My mother's china went back in the dining room hutch where it belonged. I stood in my kitchen, again, watched them drive away. Marcus had tried one last time to change my mind, offering compromises and promises and anything except the acknowledgement that what they'd done was wrong. Cheryl hadn't spoken to me at all during those final days, just looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. The house felt enormous after months in the basement. I walked from room to room, reacquainting myself with the space I'd shared with Henry for so many years. The walls Cheryl had painted were the wrong colors, but paint can be changed. The furniture arrangements made no sense, but furniture can be moved. The important things, the bones of the house, the memories embedded in the wooden floors and plastered walls, those were still intact. That first night back in my own bed, I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. But this time, the sounds were coming from where they belonged, where I could feel them in my chest instead of hearing them filtered through layers of floor and ceiling. This time, I was home. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like mine, where people have known each other for decades and everybody's business is community property. Within a week, half the women from the church auxiliary had called to check on me, offering casseroles and company and carefully worded questions about what had really happened with Marcus and his family. I told them the truth, or at least the parts of it that mattered. I'd been living in my own basement while my son planned to sell my house. I'd discovered I still owned the property and decided to reclaim it. Simple as that. Some of them understood immediately women who'd raised children and buried husbands and learned the hard way that family loyalty doesn't always flow both directions. Others seemed confused, asking why I'd want to stay in such a big house all by myself. Whether I wouldn't be happier somewhere smaller, more manageable. It's more appropriate for a woman my age. But I wasn't interested in appropriate anymore. I was interested in true. The first thing I did was have the locks changed. James Patterson recommended a locksmith who came out the same day and installed new deadbolts on all the doors. Heavy brass ones that clicked shut with satisfying authority. I was the only one. With keys, the second thing I did was have the thermostat fixed. The plastic lock came off with a screwdriver, and I set the temperature at 74 degrees and left it there. If the electric bill was high, well, that was my problem now. The third thing I did was start cooking again. Real cooking, not the microwave meals and simple sandwiches I'd been surviving on in the basement. I made pot roast with vegetables and homemade biscuits with honey butter. I baked a chocolate cake just because I wanted one. Ate to pieces for dinner and didn't apologize to anyone for it. Marcus called a few times in those first weeks. His voice careful and distant, asking how I was managing, whether I needed anything, if I'd reconsidered their offer to work something out. I was polite but firm. I was managing fine. I didn't need anything. And no, I hadn't changed my mind. "Mama," he said during one of those conversations, "I hope you know we were just trying to take care of you." "I know that's what you believed," I said. "But taking care of someone and taking over their life are two different things. I don't understand the difference. That's the problem, son." By October, I'd settled into a routine that felt both familiar and new. I woke early and made coffee in my blue enamel pot, sat at my kitchen table reading the newspaper while the sun painted the walls gold. I worked in my garden, which had been sadly neglected during my basement months, but was starting to recover under careful attention. The roses were blooming again and the pecan tree was heavy with nuts. I started having company. Dorothy Sinclair, whose husband had died the previous spring, began stopping by for coffee on Thursday mornings. Then Eleanor Rodriguez joined us, and pretty soon we had a regular gathering of neighborhood widows, sharing news and gossip and the kind of conversation that comes naturally to women who've outlived their original purposes but haven't stopped living. "You should write a book," Dorothy said one Thursday. After I told them the whole story of my basement exile and legal resurrection. "Seriously, Maggie? Other women need to hear this." "What would I call it?" I asked. "How to Evict Your Own." "Son, how about The House That Love Built?" Eleanor suggested. "Because that's what this is, isn't it? You and Henry built this house with love, and you loved Marcus enough to let him move in, and now you love yourself enough to take it back."
Love it.
It was funny to think about it that way, but maybe she was right. Maybe what I'd done wasn't revenge, or selfishness, or any of the things Cheryl had accused me of in her final angry phone call. Maybe it was just the kind of love that's strong enough to set boundaries, clear enough to distinguish between giving and being taken from. The house feels different now than it did when Henry was alive, or when Marcus and his family were living here. It's quieter, certainly, but it's not empty. It's full of memories and possibility, and the particular kind of peace that comes from being exactly where you belong. I'm 73 now, old enough to know that I don't have unlimited time left in this world, but however many years I have, I plan to spend them here. In the house Henry and I bought with hope and built with patience and filled with all the love we could manage. I plan to wake up every morning in my own bed, make coffee in my own kitchen, okay? And sit on my own front porch watching the world go by at exactly the speed I choose. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus will ever understand what happened. If he'll ever see past his own sense of injury to recognize the deeper injury he caused. Sometimes I hope he will, because understanding is the only path back to any kind of relationship. But I've stopped waiting for his comprehension to make my choices valid. This morning, I'm planning the Thanksgiving menu. Dorothy and Eleanor and 3 other women from the neighborhood are coming for dinner, and I want to make it special. Turkey with cornbread stuffing, green bean casserole, sweet potato pie, the whole traditional feast. We're going to eat at Henry's dining room table, use my mother's good china, and give thanks for the things we've learned to protect and the courage we've found to protect them. After dinner, we'll sit in the living room and share stories about our lives, our losses, our small victories. We'll drink coffee from the good cups and watch the late afternoon light slant through the windows. Henry installed with his own hands. We'll be grateful for what we have instead of bitter about what we've lost. And when they go home to their own houses, their own carefully guarded spaces, I'll clean up the dishes and put away the china and sit in my rocking chair by the window. I'll watch the stars come out over the neighborhood I've called home for almost 40 years. And I'll remember that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. The pecan tree is already dropping its nuts, and I'll need to rake them up soon. But tonight, I think I'll just sit here and listen to them fall small. Solid sounds of abundance hitting the ground I've claimed as my own.